Well, tomorrow is going to be a huge day as the United States goes to the polls. Day after tomorrow, by this time, we'll most likely know who's going to be the next president of the United States. Then, of course, there are those who say that no, it's going to take a lot more time because it could well be contested given what polls are saying. It's an extremely close fight between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So let's bring you, with just a day to go, and the countdown to the US elections, what the leading national polls in America are saying. 48% say Harris is going to win, 47% say Trump. It genuinely cannot get any closer than this. And one of the interesting new developments is a poll which has been done in the state of Iowa that's traditionally been a red state. In other words, a state that's gone to the Republicans, Trump's side this time around. However, Trump down by 3%. In the context of these elections, if this poll turns out to be correct in terms of results, then that's bad news for the Republicans. But one way or the other, it's going to be very, very close indeed. My colleague Gauri Dwivedi is in the United States tracking all the developments. This is her report.
It's 24 hours to go before the election in the United States. The presidential election is pretty much tied till the very end. It's a beautiful morning here in Maryland. Remains to be seen whether the sun will rise now on Kamala Harris, who could create history by becoming the first woman president in the United States, or will it be Donald Trump, who would come back with what many felt was political oblivion. But the fact is that the issues remain the same state after state, with some issues resonating more in particular aspects. I was in Pennsylvania, where fracking was a key concern, along with the fact that poverty rates, especially amongst non-white communities, are very high, and that they feel could be addressed only if there is a stronger economic plan in place. Something that critics of Kamala Harris have said she hasn't been able to successfully communicate to her voters. We also spent time seeing how door-to-door campaigning and canvassing happens in the very last stretch of the elections. We saw that with the Harris campaign. And what we realize now is that the next 24 hours for both campaigns will essentially be about getting your voters to the polling booth. It's not about converting those who are on the fence. It's not about trying to ensure that you get more voters. It's just about ensuring that those who are registered Democrats come out and vote. Record voting has taken place in terms of early voting. They have smashed all records. But nevertheless, an election that is so tight till the very end, every vote counts. Remember, it was just by 80,000 votes that Joe Biden flipped Pennsylvania in 2020, in a state which had 7 million voters. So you can imagine how tiny that margin is, which can be flipped by just a handful or just a couple of thousand votes. So the next 24 hours, United States is going to be seeing who will be the next president. As I said, remains to be seen whether it will be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But one thing is for sure, the country is divided, and most importantly, the country is yet to make up its mind. Poll after poll seems to suggest that. In Maryland, for NDTV, this is Gauri Dwivedi.
All right, Gauri, thanks very much for being with us. We'll be coming back to you tomorrow through the day. Joining us now, John Bartlett. He's an election lawyer. Dmitry Zabelin, a geopolitical strategist. Alex Zedan, a former Republican candidate for the US Senate. Thank you all very much for being with us. Alex, let me come to you first. The Iowa poll, it must have come as a bit of a surprise for you. Let's have, in fact, that graphic up once again on the Iowa poll, which has come up. There's a 3% gap in Iowa, which has traditionally been a red state, a Republican state, between the Democrats and the Republicans. Do you believe this? Do you think this is the way it's going?
We always see these outlier polls, Vishnu, especially in the countdown to the election. We can have polls that have results that are unexpected but don't reflect what's actually going to happen. I'll point you to a poll in 2020 that showed that Joe Biden and Donald Trump were tied in Ohio, a very red state. Donald Trump ended up winning Ohio by 8 points. These are polls. I'm not going to attribute any malice to the people who put this poll together. I'm sure they're just doing their job. But these polls are essentially just snapshots of a particular moment of who you get on the phone, and they're not necessarily indicative of how this race is going. We've seen the enthusiasm on the ground for former President Trump, Republicans running out to vote early. I'm enthused and very encouraged by what we've seen so far towards a Trump victory this Tuesday.
As John Bartlett, as this election campaign winds down in the United States, how have Trump and Kamala Harris been decidedly different in the way in which they've conducted themselves? Trump went on to suggest that, look, perhaps I shouldn't have left the White House last time around. Kamala Harris was perhaps a lot more dignified and diplomatic in the way that she's sort of focusing on issues at hand. But in a sense, that's the way this entire election campaign has gone, right?
I think that's exactly right. And thank you very much for having me. First of all, belated happy Diwali to all of your viewers.
Thank you.
I think you're spot on. I think in this closing arguments, as we call it, this final week of the campaign, when each candidate is stepping up and articulating what they have to say to the American people, I think we're seeing the difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in very, very stark relief. Trump is playing to some of Americans' worst influences, the racism, the xenophobia that his speakers on his behalf at Madison Square Garden and elsewhere have been baiting. And Kamala Harris has been saying, look, I don't believe we have this enemy within, as Donald Trump calls it. I don't believe that we are Americans pitted against one another. I want everyone at the table. And in addition to that, she has articulated a plan, an economic vision, some very specific ideas that are going to be positive for American families. I think people are seeing that. I think Alex is exactly right. Turnout is very high, but I think the result of that you're going to see is a massive victory in the popular vote for Kamala Harris.
Dimitri Zabelin, would you agree that, Kamala Harris, might be gaining a last second sort of surge? And if that is the case, and I don't know if you believe that, what are some of the key issues which might affect voters right down to the last moment before they go out and vote?
Sure. So first off, thank you for having me. I think the biggest issue for all voters, and numerous polls have indicated this, is the economy. Under Trump, it certainly was, objectively better, and that's not a partisan statement. If you do see the data, it does indicate that. Some of the ongoing macroeconomic problems we see now, like inflation, were in large part caused by a combination of fiscal and monetary stimulus in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And under response, of course, would have been critiqued just as much as perhaps in over response, so to speak. In terms of voter turnout, it's not surprising that we're seeing it be so high. Mr. Trump is certainly a divisive and polarizing character, for better or for worse. And in my view, it does really come down to the economy, which a lot of people have been struggling with at this time. As far as polls go, what Alex said, I completely agree with, to the extent that polls really don't, in my view, I don't really look at them too much. Like, I do keep, a little bit of an eye on them. For instance, the most recent poll done by, I think it was Siena College and New York Times, showed roughly a 3.5% margin of error between Trump and Harris in all 7 key swing states. Pennsylvania, of course, is one of the most sought after. It's what decided the presidential election in 2020 for Joe Biden. I think they carry 19 electoral college votes. It's down from 20 the previous year. So obviously, it has a lot of strategic value to the Trump and Kamala campaign. But again, with polls, I really don't pay that much attention to them or give them too much water. For myself, in terms of the work I do and for my clients, knowing what the potential election results may be now or 24 hours from now is really of little consequence, because while there are very different approaches they have to policy, what I'm very interested in and what I relay to my clients and through my research is what secular themes are going to be maintained through both administrations. Similar to what I did my analysis for Trump and Biden's administrations.
You spoke about Pennsylvania. We've got some interesting points on Pennsylvania, how Pennsylvania could hold the keys to the White House. So let's have that graphic 4 up on the screen. And I'm just going to go through a couple of the important points on Pennsylvania. Firstly, as it's got 19 electoral votes. So it's important in that sense. Now, but just look at the history of Pennsylvania. Let's go through the points. It was pivotal in the 2020 election win for the Democrats. It's been blue except in 2016 since 1992. Trump and Harris have heavily campaigned in Pennsylvania. Harris and Trump, in a sense, are tied in this crucial battleground state. If you look at what the polls have been saying, the Harris campaign could face its toughest challenge in the state. There is a large Asian American diaspora in the state. Indian Americans are a huge group over here. there are major concerns of inflation and cost of living, which are an important, perhaps the most important electoral issues in the state. Dimitri, would you like to, or let me come across to Alex Zidane once again. Alex, would you like to just go through some of the important points in Pennsylvania and why Pennsylvania might actually hold the key?
Absolutely. I mean, Pennsylvania is sort of the biggest prize on the board in terms of swing states. It doesn't have the most electoral votes in the entire United States, but it's the one that could swing back and forth and that both parties have captured within the last 30 years. It is also a place that James Carville has called Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and the South in between, meaning that in between the two major cities, it's very rural, it's very blue collar. There are a lot of Republican voters right in between those two cities. That's another reason it's so valuable in a presidential contest, because you get those Republican voters out, as the Trump campaign has done, and cut into the margins around the cities. It can go for the Republican candidate, and the economy is so important. Pennsylvania is a little bit south of what we call the Rust Belt, but it had a very industrial economy until just a few decades ago. That change that swept the United States when the industry and the industrial economy sort of started dying down in the 70s and 80s, that really hit Pennsylvania hard. And it is a place where these prototypical folks who are hardworking, blue-collar people who are Trump supporters who may have voted Democrat in the past. We call them Trump Democrats. They were Reagan Democrats in the 80s, and now they are ready to send Donald Trump back to the White House.
Ambassador Meera Shankar, our former ambassador to the United States, thanks very much, ma'am, for being with us. I mean, it's obviously an American election, but what's at stake for people around the world, and particularly in the context of the two wars that are waging right now?
Look, I think there is a difference in the overall foreign policy approach of the two candidates, and there are some similarities. Trump has a more isolationist, protectionist approach to the world and builds on US nationalism. Kamala would be expected to continue Biden's active participation in global affairs and institutions. On Ukraine, clearly Trump has said he would like to end the war, even when he was specifically asked, would you like Ukraine to win? He said, I would like the war to end. And he could be expected to set in motion, negotiations towards this end. It would also depend on what political color the US House of Representatives and the Senate have, and that would determine to what extent he has a free hand in pursuing this. On Israel, Trump has really not said anything. He has very close links with Netanyahu. And the recent statement he made publicly was when Biden was cautioning Israel not to attack Iran's nuclear facilities or oil installations. The public advice he gave to Israel was, you must attack the nuclear facilities because that's where the threat comes from. Now, whether this is rhetorical or not, something remains to be seen, but he's likely to give Israel a free hand, and that could have consequences for peace in West Asia. Overall, with regard to China, which the US sees as its main strategic competitor and potential challenger in the years ahead, there is a similarity in approach. Trump was the first to turn US policy around on China, and he imposed tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. And Biden continued those tariffs, didn't withdraw them, and increased tariffs on certain items such as electric vehicles and renewable energy machinery and so on, and also imposed high technology sanctions, particularly on semiconductors and semiconductor know-how, for export to China. So I see that with regard to China, there could be continuity. With regard to West Asia, both candidates would support Israel's right to defend itself, but Kamala might place more emphasis
Sure.
on working for a ceasefire.
Absolutely.
In terms of Europe, again, I think there's a lot of apprehension in Europe about a potential Trump presidency because of his downplaying of NATO the last time that he was
Right.
president.
No, I agree. There
And
is certainly apprehension in Ukraine about what might happen next. I'd like to thank you very much for being with us